You should be seeing now the slides of the presentation, which is going to be about, as the title of the webinar as hinted to, about tools to work with migrants in disaster situations. And it will be articulated in 4 main elements. So the first one is going to be a short introduction based on what we have observed about this topic and why we think it's important. And then about concrete experiences and tools that are available to do 3 things mainly. First of all, gather information on migrants and use these data, this information that we have gathered in order to inform disaster risk management, so preparedness, response, recovery activities mainly. Building the capacity of disaster risk management actors to work with migrants and more broadly in contexts that are characterized by cultural diversity. And thirdly, tools and options that are available to improve coordination among key institutions. Again, this is going to be based on experiences that we have collected as IOM around the world, especially as part of the consultations that have preceded the development of the Migrants in Countries in Crisis guidelines, and that we have tried to operationalize into some more usable and practically actionable tools that we have then worked together with governments to implement. First of all, as I said, then I will just provide a few information about this topic and why we think it's important. You might have seen these numbers. This is the number of people that are at the global level migrating internationally. So we are talking about a number of probably over 250 million. These are estimates, but solid ones. And most likely the number is going to be an underestimation, if anything. So we're talking about at least 250 million people worldwide that live, work, or transit in countries that are different than their country of citizenship, their country of origin. And this is particularly important when we look at the local level, because every continent has areas or cities or neighborhoods in which a significant share of the population is composed by foreign-borns, by migrants, by people, as I said, who are working or studying or transiting through a certain area abroad. And you can see on this graph the percentage of foreign-borns in some of the main world cities that's taken from our World Migration Report from 2015, compiling local data from a variety of sources around the world. But as you can see, as I was saying, every continent has at least a few cities in which there is more than 20% of the population that is foreign-born, and in some specific neighborhood, that's likely to be even more, which means that not accounting for this group of people through local level policies, including emergency management and disaster risk management, means basically overlooking a significant share of the local population. Therefore, there are 2 main reasons to actually include migrants in disaster risk management. The first is that unless we actually do so, we are not really mitigating impacts that our communities suffer. Since migrants are such a significant presence, if we don't also protect them alongside all of our other residents, we really risk not managing to reduce the impacts of hazards on our communities. And secondly, if we actually don't include them actively in disaster risk management, we're giving up on a variety of skills, of knowledge, of experiences, of ideas on how to do disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management, which means that basically we are poorer for that, and we are going to have an action that is less cost effective because of that. However, so we are seeing over and over again that whenever disasters happen, migrants are left behind pretty much everywhere around the world. There have been a number of instances in which that have been studied, that have been documented, and the one that you see now on the slide is just the last one that we have found information on, really. And these are the fires of last year in California, which have affected a large number of migrants, mostly coming from Central America, who work in rural areas And so rural areas that have been directly affected by the fires and that have been indirectly affected because all the economic activities that have been damaged by the fires have suffered, have struggled in the aftermath of the fires themselves. And over again, we have seen migrants having little access to information because there is no consistently translated warnings and emergency communication. Migrants not knowing where to go and where to seek refuge assistance as the fires were raging. Migrants were not leaving the areas affected by the fire or at risk or for which evacuation was being enforced because they wanted to avoid arrest and deportation in the case they were undocumented, or that they kept working in these areas because they had been abused and menaced by their employers. And again, as I was saying, what we also see is kind of longer term impacts of that. Migrants might lose their livelihoods, might not have access to any sort of welfare assistance system, and therefore are not able to recover as effectively, as quickly as many of the other residents. This is just an example. We have seen many more. We have seen instances of migrants affected and facing specific challenges in last season's hurricanes in the Caribbean, in Hurricane Sandy in 2012, in the travel disaster in Togo, in the Thailand floods, but also even before Hurricane Katrina, or in the case of the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. And in all these instances, as I said, we have seen that migrants face specific challenges and that they are not very likely to be integrated as well as other groups in disaster prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery efforts. And as I quickly outlined before with the event of California, the reasons are the common reasons for these are the ones that I'm listing here. So they have limited ability to protect themselves, they have limited ability to recover, limited willingness to access assistance or limited knowledge on to where to access it. They have limited forms of supports, they are prone to being abused, exploited, to being the object of acts of discrimination, of xenophobia. And all these is linked to a number of more profound factors in how different groups of people have access to different options and opportunities and resources and information and knowledge within our societies. And definitely migrants, because of how our economies work, because of our legal system works, because of our immigration policies work, they are more likely than other groups to actually face these barriers and to have limited access to all these resources that are essential for self-protection and for finding assistance and accessing resources and information in emergencies, which means that they are often among the people who suffer more intense, longer-lasting impacts. And which also means that in the end, they are when they are affected, it is very likely that we are kind of allowing the impacts of disaster to extend well beyond the boundaries of the affected communities, to affect the families and the communities of the places migrants are coming from, because they are linked to these places through networks, through, of course, emotional connections, through remittances, etc. And therefore, there are much broader impacts when migrants are affected that are felt way beyond the actual place that is directly hit by a hazard. And all these impacts are not necessarily factored in. Before we actually move into some options to better integrate migrants in disaster management efforts, I would like to just point out a couple of things. At the global level, we have now the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which kind of guides all efforts to reduce the impacts of natural hazards and of man-made hazards at the global level, at national level, and at local level too. And the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction highlights the need for local authorities in particular to integrate migrants in disaster risk reduction design and implementation, and highlights the necessity for migrants to be involved in DRR because of all the contributions they can give really to host communities and home communities, because of all the positive impacts that they can produce and they can bring on the resilience of places. And there are more reference to this issue and to the necessity of working on it in the recently approved text of the Global Compact on Migration, which really acknowledges these elements as part of its Objective 7, which is about addressing and reducing the vulnerabilities in migration, and really requires to support migrants that are affected by crisis situations, including disasters, accounting for migrants in emergency management. So this idea of migrant-inclusive emergency management, migrant-inclusive disaster risk management, more specifically, is on the global agenda, and it's something that has been highlighted as significant by the main relevant policy forums over the last years. And of course, the MICIC guidelines document that I was referring to before provide a sort of blueprint for the implementation of relevant efforts. Now, in order to actually talk about concrete measures, I've highlighted these three main areas: so data collection, capacity building of personnel and institutions that are working on this topic, and coordination. There are obviously many more ways to categorize it, but just in terms of highlighting some of the main or more interesting practices and tools that I could present, this is the way I will structure it. Data collection is obviously the first one that comes to mind when in many categories, in many types of work when you actually talk about migrants, because there are a number of recurring challenges when trying to measure the presence and the characteristics and the location of migrants. Migrants might be irregular or undocumented, might have arrived in undocumented fashion or in regular fashion. They might have overstayed their visa, they might not have registered. Institutions having data might not share it necessarily as promptly as it might be needed. Migrants might move too much to actually be captured by national and local level data collection and census-like system. But what we are seeing more and more is that in many efforts that relate to service provision, to access to basic services and opportunities, and including in all the work that relates to disaster risk management, migrants are often invisible and end up being unaccounted for because also of these data collection challenges. So what we have tried as IOM to do has been in many cases to promote the use of as many different sources of data as possible, in addition to official sources of data, so to registries and existing data collection systems that are managed by governments at national or at local level. We have really tried to access as much as possible information that's held by all the different stakeholders that work with migrant or on migration issues. And that all obviously means in every different context, trying to gather data from a number of different institutions and sources that might be more or less formal. And you can see a list here. In addition, something that we've also tried to do in many cases is to try to build collective profiles about migrants' presence in a certain area, trying to aggregate information from these different sources I was saying, trying to understand the prevalent features of different groups, trying to look into whatever evidence might exist from previous news or studies, in particular, for instance, on the involvement of migrants in previous disaster situations. And then probably more key of all this list, to try to have interviews with key informants. So whenever individual data on the presence of migrants and on characteristics of migrants is not available, then we really try to leverage knowledge that is held by key informants in their community, try to have a collective understanding of what migration communities in a certain place or in a certain country actually look like. And this is the kind of tools that we propose to different governments and to different partners on this topic. So we do produce national migration profiles, which kind of chart broad trends, numbers on migration flows or migration stocks in a certain country, and distribution of migrants, and generic characteristics of the different migrant groups. We have more in-depth methodologies that's called the displacement tracking matrix, which has been used to track presence of migrants in some countries. And we have a data collection tool on migrant groups to actually carry out interviews with key community informants, which allows, as I said, to have a generic idea of what are the characteristics of migrant groups in a certain area. And with this data, we have been able to provide some examples of applications to disaster management. For instance, in Mexico and in Thailand, and in another couple of countries, we have used migration data to understand what are the high-risk areas in terms of disaster risk. So the areas more exposed by hazards, more exposed to hazards, sorry, which host the largest share of migrants. To understand in countries that are new to this kind of policies and efforts, where such efforts should concentrate first. So to understand priorities in terms of working on migrant-inclusive disaster risk management. In Mexico, in addition, this kind of data, so on the flows of migrants and on the places in which migrants look for assistance along their migration routes, has also been used to map where shelters are for migrants and to understand which shelters on the territory might be at high risk, which ones might need, for instance, structural strengthening, might need some additional planning, might need some resources in case a disaster strikes. So trying to understand what shelters are located in high-risk areas and what measures might need to be taken in order to reduce risk to these structures that are key for managing migrants assistance in disasters as well. Another example of how this data has been used comes from Turkey, where the data on the incoming Syrian refugees has been used to recalculate earthquake risk, basically. So Turkey has been hosting probably up to 3 million Syrian refugees since the country started being in turmoil, which means that the population, just the number of people exposed to risks has changed a lot in some of the high earthquake risk areas in the country, and which means that by including mobility data into traditional risk assessment methodologies, local institutions can have a better understanding of what kind of impacts they would look at in case a given earthquake were to strike areas that have this kind of sudden shift in demographics over the last few years. And this is something that is really important for any sort of movement. It could be, the movement, the arrival of tourists, for instance, in the high season, the presence of migrant workers, the presence of migrants in transit, depending on the season. So it's really important to use migration data to also build scenarios on and to actually update with real data our risk assessments and in order to improve preparedness and to actually understand, again, as I said, impacts and potential consequences of hazards. And of course, there is a key importance of all this information, the more fine-grained one on the characteristics of the different migrant groups in order to support preparedness planning. Because by knowing the characteristics of migrants, what languages they speak, what are their cultural preferences, what are the media they use, it is possible to build better prepared systems. So, and by that I mean it is possible to identify additional languages. Some messages should be translated into. It is possible to identify additional channels through which information should be disseminated before, during, and after disasters. And it's also possible to provide better assistance. It's possible to stockpile specific resources that might be needed in some areas, it is possible to plan evacuations considering different numbers of different characteristics of the people that are actually living in certain areas. And it's possible to deploy personnel with specific skills to places in which a large presence of migrants is expected. And of course, it's also possible to better plan recovery assistance because it's possible to understand what might be the population, for instance, that might not be covered by existing models of assistance, might not be entitled to it, or might have specific skills, characteristics, and priorities and preferences that might be different from what the assumption for the local population might be. So again, by using this data, it is possible to improve disaster risk assessment. It's possible to look for priorities for focusing more in-depth activities, and it's also possible to directly improve local level preparedness planning. In terms of service provision, which is the second main area on which I will be focusing, I've mentioned before some of the main challenges that migrants face, but the point I think that emergency management institutions, disaster risk management institutions really need to think about is that by actually accounting for these challenges, they are able to better fulfill their mandates. Their mandate is to protect the population, to reduce the impacts of hazards on communities, and by accounting for these challenges proactively, they are able to do just that. And there is also then a matter of by protecting people beforehand, by making sure that everyone is aware, it's prepared, and it's able to be as autonomous as possible. Overall costs of the response are increased, and it is also possible to avoid a situation of stress and dissatisfaction of the response personnel that's actually on the ground and that's trying to do their best to fulfill their mandate, to do their job, and that might face difficulties when facing the limited understanding by the people they are working with, or limited trust levels. And so in order to make the whole individual and collective work of emergency management system more effective, more smooth, there are a number of things that we have seen have been carried out by institutions all over the world. First of all, of course, it's training of emergency responders. Emergency responders need to be made aware of migrant presence, of migrant-specific characteristics, needs, priorities, capacities, and they need to be made aware of their role. They need also to be empowered to actually adapt assistance in a manner that responds to people's specificities, which is something that's fallen under the approach in many countries of so-called cultural competence, so which is the ability of services to work in culturally diverse environment by adapting services accordingly to the needs and to the priorities of people receiving them. This is something that can be done through kind of longer-term training as part of preparedness efforts, but it's also something that can be done through quick briefings that responders receive just before being deployed on the field in the case of a disaster. We're thinking about people that would be assigned to a specific area and would need to be made aware that in that specific area there is likely a presence of migrants, of people that might speak a different language, that might want to hide rather than seek the help of responders, for which specific procedures might be in place in case they need some form of assistance by other actors, etc. And so both longer-term training and pre-deployment briefings can really help responders work more effectively in disaster situations. And we have documented relevant work for Mexico, Thailand, and Germany in recent publications, in case you are interested to see how these kind of models for capacity building work in different contexts. There is another part of this work that concerns, in particular, preparedness planning, and in particular, the identification and the planning of emergency shelters, of key facilities in which migrants and other affected persons would look for assistance. And all these planning can be improved by, as I was mentioning quickly before, deploying the right staff in the right places, in the places in which we are expecting to have a significant presence of people who speak a different language, who might have specific documentation needs, for instance, or legal assistance needs, or that might not be necessarily documented. And for this, so planning before and in terms of where to deploy, train staff, interpreters, cultural mediator, translators, or personnel who speaks multiple language, volunteers, other members of the migrant community who are willing to support these efforts. This is really very important in terms of effective delivery of emergency services in disaster times. And of course, the same can be said for stockpiling or pre-positioning of all the resources that are needed for managing these facilities. May it be food or non-food items for which migrants might show some culturally specific preferences or needs, and therefore for all these kind of basic services, preparedness is actually key, and again, based on knowledge and understanding of what the specificities of the different migrant groups are. In order to support these kind of efforts, IOM has developed a few tools. We have trainings for responders, and we have some checklists for the adaptation of local evacuation plans and for these kind of briefings to emergency responders. And these, along with all the other materials from IOM that I will be mentioning throughout this presentation, these are materials that can be accessed for free on our website, but can also be supported in their actual implementation through our country offices, in case you're interested in working more with them. On the other side, we also have tools for the personnel of foreign services, so for embassies and consulates that work with migrants. I'm not sure to what extent this is relevant to the audience of this specific webinar, but I just thought it could be mentioned. These are also important factors in response. And then there is another set of efforts that many countries and many institutions have started supporting in recent years, which is the direct engagement of migrants in the emergency management and disaster risk management work. Whether it is for purposes of raising migrants' awareness on disasters and preparedness measures, consulting migrants on their needs, or actually making sure that you have migrants volunteering and participating as staff members in these efforts. A lot of countries have done so. IOM has supported similar efforts in Thailand or South Korea. Germany has had a massive program at national level with their civil society, with their civil protection, technical agency, through which they were actually developing the skills of newly arrived migrants in Germany by hiring them for emergency response teams, basically, which has both the obvious benefit for the institution that has then a personnel that is more likely to be able to work in culturally diverse environments, but it's also very good for the migrants because they acquire skills that are usable for also finding employments, for instance, and they actually end up being integrated in local networks and therefore can kind of bridge a little bit the barriers with the host community, which for new coming migrants is particularly might be particularly different. The Sendai city actually does as a similar program for the recruitment of disaster interpreters, the disaster interpreter volunteers, which is, however, not only targeting newly arrived residents, but it's also for Japanese people who speak multiple languages. But the idea is to provide a pool of people who can translate materials, who can man shelters or hotlines, for instance, and that can participate in the preparedness workshops that migrants that are open to migrants, that are open to new residents, so that they can again translate or they can bridge any sort of cultural difference that might exist with the Japanese trainers in these instances. So These are a couple of examples of how these work to actually recruit migrants and making sure that the pool of skilled resources, capacities, profiles of disaster risk management organizations is a little bit more diverse, have been articulated around the world. And again, IOM proposes a tool which we have, as I said, used in Thailand and South Korea, which is a basic tool for migrants, for raising migrants' awareness on disasters in a certain area, on preparedness measures that are recommended, and on responses and support options that are available. And it's something that we have used to, again, give an opportunity to emergency response bodies to have a first contact with migrant communities, which then might evolve into more solid engagement and maybe recruitment of migrants as staff members or volunteers for more structured work. Similarly, we've helped governments develop communications that is multilingual. That's also a service that we can provide. And lastly, the last area of work that I was referring to is the coordination element. And the coordination element, I think, is probably the key one, but also in some sense a low-hanging fruit of all this work. The rationale behind this is that we do know that it is the authorities of the disaster-affected states that bear the primary responsibility to protect all the people in their territory. That includes also migrants. So typically it would be the Civil Protection Agency or the mandated Emergency Management Agency that actually have the primary role and responsibility to coordinate all efforts. However, we also know that there are a number of different actors that also contribute to these efforts, both in general terms, because emergency management systems, disaster management systems are multi-stakeholder and are well coordinated usually, but also because in the case of assistance that's specifically targeting migrants, there are a number of additional actors that come into play. And some actors are actually more qualified than traditional disaster management actors to provide services to migrants. And therefore, coordination is really essential. I'm thinking about coordination among institutions of the same country, but also coordination among institutions of countries, maybe of the countries of origin of the migrants and of countries of destination. And I'm giving you a few examples of how this work has been articulated as well. First of all, so in Mexico, we have worked to support local platform at national, so federal level, but also at state and local level between the civil protection actors and the immigration actors. So these are actors that did not necessarily have a solid work relationship before, and that now share a lot more in terms of information and actual roles and responsibilities in disaster preparedness and response. And the involvement in particular of the migrant assistance actor in the civil protection system has allowed to have a much better channel to reach to migrants, especially migrants in transit, undocumented migrants in transit in times of disasters. And in addition, we also have supported a number of coordination platform and experience sharing platforms among foreign services of different countries, especially in Asia, between authorities of countries through which migrants might transit in crisis and countries from which migrants are coming from, for instance, in Cyprus, but especially between the governments of the countries that are sending countries and that are hosting countries. And that's something that's actually happened in the Latin American Caribbean region quite strongly under the Pueblo process, but also recently under the CMC earlier this year. At local level, this work can actually cannot prescinde from the involvement of local level organizations that are working with migrants on a day-to-day basis. Really, there are a number of actors within communities that they do provide services to migrants that are the reference point for information, for coordination, for everything that migrants need for adjustment to their host communities. And these are also the actors that are likely to be their first resource in case of a disaster. And empowering these actors and making sure that coordination happens between emergency management systems and these actors is really essential for an effective response. And the example the slides referred to is something that's taken place in California, where the so-called Farm Worker Care Coalition, which is basically a consortium of local level organizations that work with migrants, has had their personnel trained on disaster preparedness and response, has created preparedness plan and response plan for their personnel and for the communities they are working with, and then has integrated these plans formally within the local incident command structure and of the emergency management system, which means that now the emergency management system basically works through formalized channels down to the community level, down to the level of isolated farm workers working in rural areas in California through civil society organizations that now participate in emergency management systems. So these were people that were providing language courses, legal advice, basic community services, and now they are also providing emergency management, preparedness and response systems. And other examples come from Christchurch in New Zealand that was affected by earthquake in 2010 and 2011, and their coordination was established among the city council, groups of interpreters and translators, community organization working with migrants again, community radios, and the New Zealand immigration authorities to create a better communication system that would be able to translate information, that be disseminated through the proper channels, and to also make sure that migrants' opinions and feedback on the reconstruction process would be heard by local authorities. And this Community Language Information Network Group, which is the extended name for the CLING, it's actually a structure that has survived the short-term response and kind of shorter-term recovery efforts, and it's still working at the local level to make sure that procedures for a translation, dissemination of relevant information and for two-way communication between migrant communities and the local governments are in place in case another disaster takes place. Again, IOM can support these kind of efforts. We have methodologies to support coordination events, and we have supported quite a number, as I said, at national level, at local level, but also at regional level. And we also support more local level interventions in terms of stock taking of relevant actors. This is something, again, that's happened in Mexico, where we have developed a national level atlas of all the organizations that exist on the territory for providing assistance to migrants, especially migrants that are transiting through the country. That was the main rationale behind developing that tool. But all this is based on these kind of interventions can be based on tools that are existing and that we are sharing through our website, and you're happy to have a look at. Again, as I said, both to gather knowledge on relevant organizations that can provide support to migrants, and in particular for interpreters, translators, and mediators. And I should also say that we have last year we have documented a number of examples of this kind of work from all over the world in a more detailed manner. All this is available through a publication that's called Migrants Inclusion in Disaster Risk Reduction, and that's also available on our website. I would just like to conclude with a few lessons learned that from this body of work that we have observed from our own efforts, but also from the efforts of other people whose work we have highlighted. And I think, first of all, there is the need to consider how conducive the local institutional framework is. We are really looking at widely different contexts, Thailand, Mexico, Germany, etc. But I think what really makes a difference is how the local migration policies are shaped, what is migrants' access and migrants' entitlement in normal time to services and opportunities, and this is really key in terms of how well migrants are respected in times of disasters. it's also key how the key actors are engaged in this topic, whether you have a strong lead on this sort of activities within the disaster management institution or within the immigration authorities. Secondly, again, as I just mentioned in the last thematic element of this presentation, the coordination is really essential. The coordination needs to extend beyond the boundaries of traditional emergency management actors to actors that might not necessarily be traditionally involved in disaster response, disaster preparedness, etc. And that includes immigration authorities, but it especially includes civil society organization and organizations that work with migrant communities, migrant representatives, as well as consulates, embassies, and other authorities of the countries migrants are coming from. Thirdly, if kind of coordination systems are put in place, one of the key elements to account for is that non-traditional emergency management actors will have most likely limited experience with disasters and limited capacity to actually work in disaster scenarios, and therefore building their capacity to actually do so, it's really, really important. And again, I think the last point that we saw is that as much as we can focus on building capacities specifically for disaster preparedness, disaster response, increasing awareness of migrants, etc., I think what really ends up being fundamental is that the barriers for migrants to access services and opportunities in normal time are removed. This really ends up being the one, so the empowerment of migrants in normal time really ends up being the one key factor for ensuring that they are more resilient in terms of disasters as well. So this concludes my presentation. I am indicating on this slide links where you can access all the materials that I've mentioned, as well as the information on these different cases. And it's http://micicinitiative.iom.int. And there is also an email address, micsecretariat@iom.int, which you can address any question or any comment. You can just contact us for any question on this presentation, or if you want to be also connected with relevant people that might be working in your country. I thank you very much for your attention, and I think we have some 10 minutes probably for Q&A. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's not an immediate question. I just wanted to say thank you so much. My name is Muriel, and I'm signing in from the Barbados office, the UNICEF Barbados office. And thank you so much for sharing information on the data collection. I think this is very pertinent because we are also looking into how can we strengthen the existing regional tools well in advance of an emergency, so that we already anticipate that we have migrants in the region that we need to capture when we do our rapid needs assessments and other tools that exist for data collection. I think your point also on engaging service providers and sensitizing them is very timely. And I'm thinking in the context of UNICEF work, if we look at the way we deliver social, psychosocial support, for instance, and the need for cultural sensitivity in those contexts. So I think the areas that you touched on are very pertinent, and of course hoping that there will be some further engagement, especially as we continue to fine-tune the tools that we have to put that migrant lens. I think you challenged us to be migrant inclusive in our approach and to apply a migrant sensitive lens when we are planning our preparedness and our response. So thank you very much for the presentation. And I think the silence is because maybe the other partners also are, trying to understand this new platform that we are using and where you can submit your questions. But next time will be more interactive, definitely. But thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the thank you for the feedback. And indeed, all the emergency health and psychosocial support services, these are among the ones for which cultural sensitivity and attention to specific communication needs, different perceptions of pain, different culturally acceptable treatment. These are all elements that are really important and for which migrants' presence really, as you were saying, challenges preparedness and response for emergency service providers. So I think it's definitely something that that would fall within the scope of a migrant-inclusive, migrant-sensitive approach.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Some other participants would like to comment or ask questions before we finish this session?
Good afternoon. This is Shari Innisgrand from Barbados Country Office. I just wanted to say thanks so much for this presentation. And I think as we look ahead to our virtual policy network and sustainable and resilient Caribbean, I'm really excited about getting information like this shared more broadly, specifically with that policy network, because definitely considerations of the most vulnerable communities and ensuring that no one is left behind really necessitates that we look at how to reach those communities beforehand and in a disaster situation. And I think you bring such a wealth of information. Very much appreciated.
Thanks for the feedback. And if you have anything specific that you're interested into, just feel free to write me and my colleagues in the team, and we'll be able to provide any more detail on any of the practices mentioned or on additional ones.
Okay, thank you very much, Lorenzo, and all the participants for the first webinar under the CMC mechanism. I hope this is the first step in our continued coordination in order to address or to assist better the affected migrants in disaster situation, especially in the Caribbean region. So we will continue offer another topics that is regarding migrants and regarding IOM tools, how to address the mobility in the natural disaster situation.